So, our last academic panel of the afternoon is focused on economic architectures, which will include some discussions, I believe, of networks, institutions, structures within the economy. I want to, as we did with the last panel, really push people in addition to introducing themselves, and obviously these are all people that we've heard from already in the program this weekend. I want to push you, as we did with the last panel, to think about what are the areas that really need to be developed next, and particularly feel free to sort of transcend that positive economics, normative economics boundary, as some of your talks did last time. So not just what's needed for economics, but what do we need to do in the way that we think about economic systems to do better the world. And maybe with that very small request, I'll start with you, Brian.
Okay. There's 5 minutes. Is that it?
5 minutes.
Okay. I want to enlarge on something I said last night, and actually it's come up in some of the other panels, and that is that in spite of a lot of what we know in economics, there still has been financial failures, economic failures, policy collapses, all kinds of things. The euro was launched as a common currency quite a few years ago in Europe, and that turned out to be something of a disaster for Greece and Portugal and Italy, possibly also Ireland. These things were not particularly well anticipated. When policies or policy systems are put in place, what economists tend to do is simulate and try to figure out what are going to be the consequences of that policy. That's a perfectly sensible thing to do. But if you think in terms of equilibrium, as I said, there's a subtle bias with all of us economists that if things are in equilibrium, there's no way to improve on that. Otherwise, it wouldn't be in equilibrium. So we don't think in terms of people gaming such systems. With complexity economics, if we throw out this assumption of equilibrium, suddenly everything becomes a web of incentives that can be gamed or can be exploited in some way. Again, I don't want to be cynical, but I love this quotation from Janet Napolitano. In 2005, she was governor of Arizona, and people were bringing up the idea of a 50-foot wall. So this is an older idea than the current administration. And she said, "Show me a 50-foot wall, and I will show you a 51-foot ladder." So my question and challenge for economics, or for complexity economics, or even for SFI, it's not a huge challenge, but it's doable, and it could be part of some program in the future, is can we anticipate how such systems could be gamed or played or taken advantage of, and thereby collapse. Now, this is something the medical profession understands extremely well. In virology, in any sort of disease control, certain other organisms can get into the system, take it over, and cause at least severe difficulties, if not total collapse and death. How would we get systems to do that? These would be intelligent systems, systems that can learn. The trivial example I thought of was, well, I could set up a model of 50-foot walls, and then trivially I could feed it the idea that people could wheel up 92-foot walls or ladders, or 39-foot ladders, or maybe 52-foot ladders, and it would converge and discover that 51-foot ladders would do the job just about right. Now that's cheating. It's trivial because the whole qualitative idea has been thought of. So my question, I want to put it to you, I've thought a lot about this. I've written a paper called "All Systems Will Be Gamed." This was shortly after the collapse of 2008, 2009. But could we do better? Could we imagine an agent-based system or some kind of strategic counter system that takes a given policy and tries to discover how to game it? Such system would have to ponder, meaning it would have to be imaginatively creative. How could I create some policy that would exploit this given system? I don't think it's out of sight. I think it would need a lot of general knowledge. So we're talking really maybe about a form of general AI here, general artificial intelligence, where there'd be deep knowledge of how such systems have collapsed or been gamed or exploited in the past. I want to point out that when the US Navy or some other government body issues a new encryption method, then it puts that encryption method out to beta testers, mathematicians in public, and invites them to see if they can crack it. If they can't, if nobody can crack it, it's viewed as a pretty good system. So my question in general to SFI, to all the really super smart people here in the audience is, what would it mean to construct a clever, possibly agent-based intelligence system that manages to figure out how policies or institutions can be gamed, exploited. If we can do that, I think this would be a major way forward in saying we can have a much more healthy economic system. We've done this with respect to earthquakes, with respect to aircraft failure, in many other ways. Time we did it in economics.
Thanks, Brian. Bye. So I thought for economic structures, I'd pick the uncontroversial topic of markets versus states, asking what that might look like from a complex system perspective. And I'll start with two caveats. First, before anyone in the audience accuses me of being a wild-eyed socialist, I spent 20 years as a practicing capitalist before going back to academia. And my co-author in this work is, he was the first investor in Amazon, so he's a rather successful capitalist. So what we're advocating is something different than our current form of capitalism and not socialism. The second thing is this is a personal perspective, but I think it's a big topic that SFI in this community, needs to start exploring more. So first, in the neoclassical framework, we've had markets and states positioned as something in opposition to each other. That markets are kind of a default setting for society, and they're efficient at allocating resources, but other institutions, notably governments, are considered inefficient. And there's basically two arguments that support this. One is the neoclassical rational choice equilibrium argument, that markets automatically come to the Pareto optimal equilibrium for society. This was Ken Arrow and DeBro's great work. The second is more out of the Hayekian tradition, that markets are efficient at processing distributed information to help coordinate activity in the economy. But both these views agreed that that governments are less efficient than markets, accepting a few specific conditions where you have market failures and public goods. And they also both accepted that sometimes other non-economic social considerations would require state intervention. But, and this was the big but, there was always a big trade-off, which was the name of a famous book by Arthur Oken in the 70s, between economic equality and social issues and economic efficiency and growth. Now, this kind of big trade-off has framed our politics since, where the left sees more market failures and values more the kind of social issues, and the right sees fewer market failures and values more the growth and opportunity side of things. But despite the huge noise and tensions in our politics, they were both kind of agreeing on the same core theory. And I would ask, though, does complexity give us a different core theory that might create different disagreements and different debates? And I would put forward that markets and states really should be viewed as an ecology, a kind of interlinked, interdependent, complex adaptive system. And asking whether you want more markets or more states makes as much sense as asking, do you want more plants or animals? I mean, it's a kind of nonsensical question. They're both part of the same ecosystem. Rather, the real question is, how do you get a healthy ecology? Now, if you bought my message yesterday that prosperity comes from human cooperation to solve human problems, and progress is the improvement in those solutions over time, then I would argue that changes the view on both the role of markets and states. So in that view, the real genius of markets is not necessarily efficiency and allocation, but rather creating an evolutionary competition for solving human problems. And the primary job of business is to solve human problems. And the primary job of the state then is to create the conditions for large-scale cooperation to allow that process to happen. And that involves things like promoting inclusion. You can't have large-scale cooperation if you're systematically excluding large groups of people. You have to have fair social contracts, so that the basis of cooperation is fair and sustainable. You have to have institutions that build trust, like the rule of law, money, regulation. And also you need the state to help solve collective action problems to kind of grease the wheels of cooperation. And then finally, you could add that in a democratic system, people have a right, even a duty, to define the fitness function that the market system is evolving toward. So issues like social equity, climate change, other things are valid social concerns that should be reflected in that market fitness function. And so I would argue that we should worry more about creating a healthy ecology that promotes real tangible improvements in people's lives, and less worrying about kind of theoretical trade-offs in efficiency in the system. So rather than thinking of them as competitors, think of them as a joint system. And as Scott Page mentioned in his talk, and he's done some work with Jenna Bednar on this, this ecology has lots of different forms of organization, not just markets and states, but a broader kind of zoo of forms of organization. And we need to consider that, that system in the round. And I think Santa Fe and the complex systems view could really help us get much deeper insights into that. There it goes.
There you
Just
go.
under 5 minutes.
So it's great to follow Eric on this. So first of all, I want to say I think it's useful for us to step away from labels like economists and physicists and sort of bashing caricatures of economics, and instead really focus in on what it is that we think is broken and where we can make a difference and how we can improve the world. And I think, I like John Miller's framing of things this morning in terms of knots and ropes. And part of it has been we look at the system and we're trying to understand the system, and we can look at individual knots and try to understand how behavioral problems are there. And behavioral economics has done a lot to sort of expand economics from a system where we had rational actors and systems that were frictionless to situations where there are problems in terms of rationality and computation. I think the other aspect of it, and part of this panel in terms of architecture, is that we care about how the structure matters in terms of who's acting with whom, how are they interacting, how does that matter. And I think that Cosma sort of put it well when he was talking about Becker's description of how constraints in markets make a difference. And so you actually sometimes actors have really very little to do with things. So agent-based modeling can be very important in understanding systems where actors and individual actors make a difference. But there's a lot that's governed by structure itself. And if we want to understand financial markets and where the failings are, these are fairly large structures, and we can see a lot that's structurally going on without actually getting into too much detail on the individual level. So I think that there's sort of level for this, room for this kind of level of thinking. And secondly, I think, I'll sort of echo this idea of the first welfare theorem, which is, I'll go a little deeper into it. So first welfare theorem really comes out of Marshall and then gets elaborated on by Pigou and eventually was really put into place by Lerner in the Lang-Lerner debates with Hayek and von Mises about whether socialist economies can function. And it's interesting that the first welfare theorem about how markets are efficient actually came from somebody trying to push the socialist perspective. So it was Lerner who really formalized it. But the idea there is, markets efficiently allocate things, they get prices right, they move goods around. And what's wrong with that? When does it go wrong? So it allows Scott to buy his socks. It allows us to, to get these chairs that we're sitting on. It does a lot of, really wonderful allocation. But there's two things that it doesn't do. One is that it doesn't talk about who gets what. So it doesn't talk about what's the distribution of profits and rents that occur in an economy. And the second is it doesn't talk about externalities. So it applies in worlds where what I do doesn't, whether I'm sitting on this chair doesn't affect whether somebody else is sitting on their chair. Or what color socks I buy doesn't cause a shortage in the sock market. When you look at financial markets, those are different, right? So those markets don't function in the classical way where we get efficient allocations and efficient movements. And why is that true? Counterparty risk, this term, is something that's real. So if I take a position and I have debts to you, and I take a wildly risky portfolio, and I end up going bankrupt, that causes problems for your business. And that's fundamentally different from the kinds of markets that operate well. And understanding the architecture then is important, because we have to know if I default, who's it going to hurt, right? And so we want to understand how these markets work. And I think from a complex systems perspective, the easy kind of answer is say, this looks like contagion, right? So we know about how contagion works. We see flus, we see things like that, and we can talk about movements of capital around just like disease and so forth. I think when we really get into these, this is where doing our homework matters and trying to understand things in detail matters. And so I think of an analogy, if I was a soccer coach and I think about soccer and I say, okay, look, there's people, they're moving a ball around, they make passes, they try and get it in a net. Okay, so I understand soccer, and now I want to go and I see basketball, and I see people moving a ball around, and then eventually they're trying to get it in a net, and I say, well, since I know about soccer, I can take that knowledge and deal with basketball. And obviously, when we look at these kinds of simple contagious systems, when we get to financial economics, there's subtleties and specific things that go on there that make it fundamentally different from standard flu contagions. So in a financial market, if you actually densify the connections, you're diversifying. So at the same time, you're allowing things to spread more easily. You're also making people less likely to spread. And so there's fundamental differences in the way that those markets work from the way that other markets work. That means we have to adapt our systems to that. So I think the architecture, understanding these architectures, but understanding enough of the detail to know how we want to apply these things is really fundamentally important. So.
Thanks. Well, I'm Allison Stanger, and I really liked what Brian said to start off our panel. I thought I'd begin there. It's a great question to ask, can we do a better job of anticipating who is going to game the system? But then when you think about how you would deal with that problem of all systems potentially being gamed, to preempt that, you really do need government. You can't get away from government because self-regulation won't work for a variety of reasons. So the strategic counter system is smart government. Our problem, of course, is we have anything but smart government right now. That's a whole separate matter. So I thought I would come at this question from a slightly different angle and maybe start with a joke that I heard as a graduate student at Harvard. I'm a fallen economist, by the way. I was very influenced by Larry Summers' 1984 NBER paper on the scientific illusion in macroeconomics. I don't know if any of you remember that. That really influenced my thinking. But the joke of the time was, what happens to a mediocre mathematician? They become a brilliant economist. What happens to a mediocre economist? They become a brilliant political scientist. So, okay, I'm an example. I started in math, went to economics, then went to political science, so I'm fallen in some sense. But I want to suggest that if we get more voices in the room, we can think more creatively about economics. And we're seeing a little bit of it here today, and it's indeed one of the foundations of SFI. So I want to make 3 points here, and they're really focused on complexifying the agent, him or herself. So if we're talking about the idea that's done the most harm, many people have focused on the rational actor model, Homo economicus. I would add to that neoclassical economics, like many Enlightenment projects, was unaware of its own blind spots. It abstracted away key aspects of the human condition, namely here, I mean, the human desire to connect and to belong to something. So Homo economicus, therefore, needs to be supplemented with what I would call, and this comes out of work we did at Bellagio with Anne-Marie Slaughter, who Scott mentioned, replaced with something we call sapiens integra, which is basically that Homo economicus seeks to maximize individual economic utility, whereas sapiens integra seeks to grow capability, their own and those of their networks. So they care about both individual and collective flourishing. So what does that mean for the ecology of any economic architecture? What that means is that it must include both types of agency and incentives, because at different points in time, some will prioritize the pursuit of profit, others the pursuit of capability, both for themselves and their communities. So we can talk about what 4 core capabilities would be. We mentioned learning or education, health, relationships, and community. But from this, you get an idea of a moral economy, which is one that does not render invisible the possibility of sapiens integra. Because this might sound, I'm the one female on the panel, this might sound like some kind of gendered thing, but I don't think it is. I think all humans seek both of these things just in varying degrees. You know, and some who are in the 10% that was mentioned earlier become economists, but that's another matter. But this isn't gendered. Final point to ponder. Does sapiens integra become Homo economicus when empowered? Because this is something really interesting to think about. Neoclassical economical models assumed empowered rather than exploited or dominated agents. And that leads to a whole variety of unintended consequences and ramifications. The economy that is, I think, looks very different depending on where you sit in a socioeconomic hierarchy premised on wealth. And the character of that hierarchy obviously raises inevitable political questions. So I think an appreciation of diversity's potential role in revitalizing both the rule of law, on which free market capitalism depends, should be of critical importance. And some of Scott Page's work is very interesting on this. If we're looking for better outcomes, if we're looking for a more healthy ecology, this might be one way to do it. So just to conclude, I wanted to endorse an earlier idea that was first suggested by Gary, and then I think Josh liked it as well. Eric did too. And this is the idea of an open source public library of cognitively plausible agents. I think this could be a great bridge to both the policy world and more humanistic areas of inquiry, since both agents and economies have histories, which means that humans might be conceived of as emergent phenomena as well as economies. This is a kind of neat way to get back to Jeff's point about bringing velocity and time back into our models and our ways of thinking. Wow. How's that?
So one of the common themes that's emerged, not just in this panel, but in many of the discussions we've had, is a sense that the current system, the current economic architecture, is unsustainable. But there seems to have been, despite economics' moniker as the dismal science, an almost groundswell of optimism for how we can improve it and what could come next. I'd like to push all of you to maybe think about, as we go into this transition, what are some of the potential pitfalls? What are some of the architectures we could end up with that would actually be as unsustainable as what we have now, or in other ways worse than what we have now? What are you afraid of as we go into a sort of a transition of how we organize or architect our economy?
I have to tell you, I'm much, to go back to what Jeff West said, I'm much more worried about the environment and climate change, and possibly also about the future of AI, than I am about the economy. But let me give you one thing. This is not continuing the theme that I was on earlier, just very quickly. I think the coming of artificial intelligence and the taking of a lot of economic functions and putting them into a digital, rather invisible economy that executes largely without human beings, is on its way. Eric mentioned John Keynes's article in 1930, Economics Prospects for Our Grandchildren. And Keynes foresaw that we'd have a lot of technological unemployment round about now, or slightly in the future, 100 years, and that we might be in a situation, I think this is coming, where in principle we have enough goodies or wealth or to distribute among everybody. We're well off as an economy, whether it's the US or Japan or Germany or anywhere else. But the problem is if people don't have access to that, if jobs start to disappear seriously, and I think they possibly will, then having all that wealth is not going to be that useful if people can't have access to it. So to answer your question, I think we're moving from a situation in the economy that, where the primary problem is production. Can we get more stuff produced, more goods, more services, better ones? That's always going to be a challenge. We're moving from that into how do we manage to make sure everybody has access to whatever's there. We're moving into a distributive era, and that means questions of efficiency are less important than questions of who gets what. And that's causing a huge political disruption, not just in this country, but all across Europe. I can feel it and see it to some degree in China as well, and in Asia, and it will affect all advanced economies. How do we get by in an era where distribution of wealth becomes the dominant problem? We haven't solved it.
I mean, like Brian and many others share concerns about, huge concerns about the twin stresses of climate change and huge technology disruption that are coming. But I kind of have a meta concern overlaying that, which is our capacity to deal with those challenges. In short, our ability to kind of solve collective action problems and work together to figure out how we address those. And many of you know Robert Putnam's work, famous sociologist who's written a lot about social capital. He's got a new book coming out.
Political scientist.
Political scientist, excuse me. He has a new book coming out, and I saw a preview of it, and he had a lot of data showing a huge breakdown in our kind of social connections, and this is building off of his famous Bowling Alone work, and a rise in this kind of hyper-individualism in attitudes, particularly across Western societies, which he argues, I think rightly, has reduced our capacity to work together. There's multiple explanations for this, but the kind of, again, economic ideology that's been dominant has emphasized this, again, that, sort of pursuing self-interest is good. And, you asked yesterday most dangerous ideas in economics. I would add to the list what's called methodological individualism, which is this idea that we are all just individuals working in isolation, only interacting transactionally. And this led to Margaret Thatcher's famous quote, "There's no such thing as society." Well, if you stop believing there's such thing as society, you stop believing the ability of society to act together to handle a challenge like climate change or technology. And at the root of this is a confusion between collectivism, which the neoliberals critiqued and quite rightly, versus solving collective action problems. So, one of the big successes of the Enlightenment project was an emphasis on individual freedom, individual rights, and so on, a huge jump forward for humankind. But then taking that to an extreme, we lose sight of our ability to work together to solve collective action problems. And so we have to kind of rediscover ways to create an ideology and system of thought that allows us to tackle these huge existential problems together.
Let me say, I think, and this goes sort of a broad view of economic systems. I think one thing I touched upon yesterday was that these interact with social systems. And so if we don't understand this social fabric, then we miss a lot of what's happening in the economics. And that has to do with access to education, access to jobs, a lot of things that I've spent a lot of time researching. I think the other answer, and this gets back to Jeffrey's question about why people aren't leading the charge in climate change. And there, I think if you look, there was a letter signed by economists. I signed it, calling for higher carbon taxes. There's debates about exactly how high those carbon taxes need to be and what level they should be at. I don't think there's any disagreement among a lot of economists about what needs to be done in order to get reductions in carbon emissions and to move things in the right direction. I think what's missing is that layered on top of this is a political system. And we have markets interacting with the politics, and unless the politics are willing to make long-term, very costly decisions that will impose taxes that actually bring things into line, nothing's going to happen. And so somehow, saying, okay, we just have to get the economics right, that's not it. We really need to understand this as part of a big system, and the big system involves people having vested interest in politics not necessarily representing the majority view in the world of we have a crisis and we need to solve it, and it's a long-term crisis. And these kinds of problems are ones that I think we don't have the models yet, we don't really understand, and if we want to get something improved on that level, we have to have some better understanding of the interaction between politics and economics and social structures.
Yeah, excellent. I couldn't agree with you more. And I'm an outlier in another way. I spend a lot of my time trying to intervene in the political system to produce some results, because what I see in Washington is that, everybody there can be fired if they don't toe the party line. The great thing about tenured academics and why they should be involved more in politics is that nobody can fire you for saying what's true. And so I feel an obligation to do that in the work I do. And then once you say it, it's in the congressional record, and that frees up a space for things to happen. Now, I'm not trying to minimize the problems we face, but that's something we can think of. What I'm afraid of, the same sorts of things that you are, I'm also afraid of, not to sound like Roosevelt, but I'm afraid of fear itself, because it's contagious. And if we think it's hopeless, we're going nowhere, so I refuse to give in to that. I'm also very afraid of the growing social inequality we see, that I believe the digital economy, as Brian mentions, is simply going to reinforce and exacerbate. So thinking about how we're going to address that is an enormous challenge. And here I have 3 suggestions. They're very practical. You can apply them at your company, or wherever else you may be working. 1, you can question inequality of outcomes whenever you see it. Doesn't mean there's some sort of bias or discrimination there. Not at all. But you can at least step back and say, why do all these people look the same? Or do they have the same degree? And see if maybe you're missing some excellence in that system you haven't seen previously. Second, you can do the same thing with any table where you're discussing these issues. Be sure, that there's diversity around the table. I mean this not only in terms of different disciplines, hugely important, but also in terms of civil society, government, and business. The biggest problem I had with the Partnership for AI was that it entirely left government out of the discussion table, and that's not going to produce solutions. And finally, I think we can all, I said this earlier, we can interrogate our own blind spots. We're kind of in a call-out world where there seems to be an assumption that only certain groups of people have blind spots. They're human. They're so human. I just had one of mine revealed to me the other day with a panel at New America for my book, where we were putting together who should be on this panel to discuss the book. This person's really smart, this person's really smart, this person's really smart. Oh, they're all white men. Can't we do better than this? Isn't there somebody of color that might have something important to say? And you know what? I stopped to think about it and think, oh my God, I have the perfect person. She stole the show on the panel. So I just offer myself up as an example of a person with blind spots as well.
So I want to open this up to the floor and make this more of an interactive conversation. Do we have any questions for the panelists? Barbara?
So I'll start with a disclaimer, which is I do research in AI. And Brian, I'm much more worried about the economic models than I am about AI. And it's for a connection between them that other panelists have brought out. And I want to start first by recommending Mary Gray and Sid Suri's book on ghost work, which shows how wrong our images are of what. So by ghost work, they mean all of the people who do jobs over the internet. You would think they were all individuals. Actually, they form communities and advise each other. The jobs are terrible. They're not good jobs that let you work when you want to work, but rather require you pay constant attention to what's going on so you can get good jobs. So we need to think about the jobs that technology is enabling and disenabling, with the reason that corporations are trying to save money without thinking about, unlike before the 50s, without thinking about the well-being either of their employees or of those of us who are customers. So they get free labor from us by giving us bad systems. Okay. AI, it's wonderful what it can do, but it's nothing like you might think from reading all of the brochures and advertisements. So there may be AI systems that will take over jobs, but they won't be doing them as well as the people who are doing them if they were designed just to take over the jobs as opposed to complement the people who are doing those jobs. And we see this in medical care now with electronic health records that help a lot with the billing department, but none with medical care delivery. So I think we have to fix the economic system and the economic incentives in ways some of the other people were speaking about on the panel, and that's going to take the political input that Allison was talking about. So I think you should deal with your anxiety about AI by fixing the rest of it.
I wouldn't say it's an anxiety about AI. I work at Park, Xerox Park. I work directly. Okay. That was the brilliant time to be there, by the way. No, I am concerned that we've had since the early 1990s, in fact, due to telecommunications rather than computation, we were able to offshore jobs to China, to Ireland even, to Mexico. And that was, that led to much cheaper products, and it led to, you could keep track of supply chains in real time, et cetera, et cetera. And it looks like possibly some of that's ending, at least there's a political backlash to that. But now we have a new country we're offshoring things to, and that's the virtual economy. And I don't feel I have an anxiety about AI. I have an anxiety about jobs disappearing. If it's true that an awful lot of trucking in the next 10, 15 years will be done autonomously, a friend of mine in Silicon Valley has calculated that 3 million jobs are at stake, not just truck drivers, but all the pit stops and the facilities, the gas stations or whatever that depend on these. A lot of that will be automated as well. So I think that AI is going to bring us brilliant insights maybe into medical diagnosis, possibly allow us to learn individually. The benefits are going to be enormous. My anxiety is that we're not thinking enough about it. We thought a lot, I don't mean me, but in general, science thought a lot when recombinant DNA came along in the 1970s and got together and came up with protocols. I don't see we're doing that for the disappearance of jobs via automation, AI, computation, and so on. And I support all that, but I think we need to have second thoughts.
There are a couple of things. There are a couple of things that are. Oh, I'm Hamid Ben Brahim from Thomas. There are a couple of things that are happening that are disrupting the architecture of the economy in a tremendous way. One of them is the shrinking of or the disappearing of the middle class, which creates the continuum for the flow of wealth across different classes of society. And the other one is the increasing number of unemployable people thanks to gains in or advances in productivity. How do you see these two forces affecting the architecture of the economy, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, well, you put your finger on two big issues. The shrinking of the middle class, which has been quite dramatic. We're only now or quite recently gotten the right kind of data where we can really see this. over time, and particularly how far back it goes. It goes back well before even the kind of globalization and outsourcing stories of the 90s or the tech stories. It goes right back to the 1970s. So it's been going on for quite a while. And we also know that middle classes historically have been hugely important for economic growth and innovation. In fact, an economic historian has written a series of books about why this was critical to the Industrial Revolution, the development of a middle class. It's the middle class that consumes stuff, that has the jobs, and middle classes are also essential to democratic polities as well. So the shrinking has had both an economic effect and a political effect. And some of the, I should be careful with the real political scientists on the panel, but some of the political science research on the recent political trends has pointed to fears of downward social mobility, loss of status, loss of dignity in work, things like that as being crucial in creating a lot of the anger that's out there. And this isn't a one side of the political aisle or the other. It's really across both. When you look, we've done some recent comparative work across countries about the shrinking of the middle class to try and get a better handle on why. And it really does look like it has a lot to do with policy choices. That all of the developed countries are facing the same pressures from technology change and from globalization, yet some have held on to their middle classes much better than others. So there is an economic kind of architecture and policy choice to support and promote a healthy middle class. And then looking forward with the technology change issues, you can see a huge acceleration in that hollowing out coming. We recently did some work looking at the skill transitions, between which jobs are likely to get wiped out by technology, and then the skills those people have, where could they go? Because part of the argument is technology destroys jobs and it creates jobs, and over history in the wash, it all kind of works out. But there's two things that appear to be different this time. One is the speed of this change is now not, used to be at a generational clock speed, so maybe you'd have a problem but your kids would be okay. Now it's happening kind of within one lifespan. And then the second is that it's wiping out a set of skill areas that kind of have nowhere else to go. And we haven't properly dealt with the last big round of disruption, all the left behind places from industrialization, whether it's in the industrial Midwest or the northern suburbs of France or the coal mining districts of Wales. We still haven't dealt with that problem, and we're now creating a whole new set of those issues on a much, much bigger scale.
Ole?
Okay, so I just have a comment. I just wanted to sort of take a step back and just share what I'm getting out of this meeting. I noticed two really big important themes that have, thank God, come up. One is climate change and growth, its relation to growth, and the other is inequality and probably its relation to growth. And I just wanted to say, it sort of makes me think, maybe I gave the wrong talk yesterday. Do not underestimate, please, do not underestimate the power of foundational work, of going back really to basics and starting over again. So in what we've done, we have started, there is no equilibrium assumption. This would have never, ever occurred to us to put in equilibrium as an assumption into our models. And we've had, you've seen the trajectory yesterday, we've had a few man years to explore what happens when you start in this completely different way. And two big things that come out of this are the problem of climate change and the problem of inequality. And just in 2 seconds, GDP is in essence an ensemble average, and it doesn't tell you what happens to the individual. So we don't have to be addicted to GDP growth in order to create prosperity. This is just not true. That link doesn't exist, and this comes immediately out of what we're doing. So this is the climate change thing, and of course, if GDP is not connected to well-being, and you can see how things disperse and how a wealth distribution may be completely unstable, you end up with a completely different mindset. And these problems that have come out, luckily, over these days are kind of the first things that you notice when you start from this perspective. So just a comment. Thank you.
John?
Eric, I find I find the idea of markets and states being components of one large ecosystem very appealing. And with the most interesting part being how the state evolves. I see common law as co-evolving with society, with common law's many decision points and trials distributed across time and geography. But over the last century, the U.S. at least has shifted from a primarily common law country to one primarily of statutory law, which evolves much less readily than common law. And when I look at the services states provide, K through 12 education, the U.S. Postal Service, the Department of Motor Vehicles, I could go on and on. These seem to evolve least of all. Of course, they're also all subject to public choice concerns, in which factors other than the public welfare intrude on decision-making. I noticed we were dismissive of how bad the current administration is, but the fact is we cannot rely in general on having a good administration. So how do we ensure that the state evolves in a good way?
Political question.
Maybe the political scientist. Yeah, I'll punt that one over to the political
No,
scientist.
that's the $64 million question. You could say, I mean, I think what's really interesting in this current crisis is the complete misunderstanding that people even have about what the state is. You know, there's this idea that the deep state is partisan. I've been going around the country telling people, no, they seem partisan right here at this moment in time, but their behavior is a radical departure from how they've always previously behaved, with some exceptions. You know, they see themselves as serving their country and speaking unvarnished truth to power. And so for them to be leaking things in this way is precisely because they're very alarmed about this particular president and what he's doing to the very idea of public service, to which they devoted their whole life. Because whatever you want to say about the civil service, they're not in it for the money. I mean, they could all be doing something else and making more money. So that whole idea of serving the public has really been damaged by the present administration. Now, again, this is not a partisan statement. It's a statement about the system itself. And I think for us to get to a better place, we have to educate Americans on that fact as a necessary condition for them understanding certain other things about how American constitutional democracy is supposed to operate, even though it often falls short. Because I still think if you're talking about the best operating system for any regime, you can't beat the American Constitution. We have to make people realize that.
You know, I would just add that, well, first, my sister is actually works in the current government, and you know, daily tells about stories of civil servants really trying to do things, you know, for the American people. So that's often underappreciated because the news media sort of narrative is always, you know, very, very negative about the capacity of government to actually do things. And when you look around the world at the capacities of different governments, you do see, you know, no government is perfect, like no large corporation is perfect, by the way, either. But some countries, you know, have very effective civil services and you know, governments that are able to take effective action. But you know, because you know, of very specific things to the American situation and our ideology, we've degraded the capacity of particularly our civil service over decades now, and we're kind of now reaping the harvest of that. But then the question is, how do you and Frank Fukuyama has written some very good things about this. Many of you may have read. But then the hard question is, you know, how do you build back from that degraded state? And to do that, you need trust in the system, because people, if they see a poorly performing system, they're not going to trust it. So you get this chicken and the egg. They're not going to invest in it or, you know, support, you know, taxes and other things, you know, going into it. So my own view is we have to look at where trust is living today, and where there is still trust today is much more at the local level. You know, so surveys show very high levels of trust in local government, state government, and one of the beauties of the American constitutional system is this kind of devolved, you know, power structure that we don't take advantage of enough. And so I would argue we need to sort of build back state capacity, kind kind of from the local back up to the, you know, to the broader collective. And it's pretty urgent to do.
Yeah, and, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add one thing. I think that part of it is ignorance in the sense that it's very easy to be ignorant of all the things that this state does. And you know, there's actually a really wonderful website that's run by some computer scientists at Stanford, and you can go in, and what it does is it gives you actual budgets, and then you can go in and put in your own budget. So how would you design your budget for your national government, state government, local government, and so forth? And you get some impression of actually how much spending goes into each part and what all these pieces are and how much have to go to roads and how much have to go to, you know, K through 12 education and so forth. And once you see those numbers, you begin to actually see the trade-offs. And I think most people don't have an idea of the scope or the size of the state. And just having that idea then gives it more, we have a little more trust, or we have a little more understanding of what it does for us. And instead of just attacking it, understand all the benefits it provides for us.
And just one more thing, just so you see how unusual the situation is. I was supposed to speak at the State Department last Monday, subject to the approval of the Secretary of State. I was not approved. That is not the United States of America.
Hello, Haas Ali Khan. I lead a design and construction company. Are any of you guys in this room actually modeling the revolution? And I mean that seriously. The other day, Monica gave a talk about the increase of demonstrations around the world, different types of protest, anti-state movements, things like that. And it seems to me it's kind of like the elephant in the room. I mean, if you know, the recent article in the Times, like today, says that we have underestimated the rate of climate change. And there may not actually be anything left to model by 2050. So I would be interested to know if anybody in the room is modeling the revolution, and what are your assumptions, and what sort of conditions, and when should I start buying my guns, so to speak.
By revolution, you mean, say more what you mean by revolution.
Social collapse, like
Social collapse, okay.
you know, 1776 or 1789, or you know, Germany interwar or something like that. You know, these revolutions that will lead to the ultimate destruction of all the capital stock.
Except the Bitcoin.
You know, I don't know. Well, maybe Josh, have you been modeling that?
And economic hardship, and it models both ethnic war and rebellion against central authority. What are you predicting? Well, I'm trying to understand the mechanics of social collapse and civil violence, but I think the combination of decline of legitimacy and economic hardship are important components of collapse. And one of the things that's interesting is sharp declines in legitimacy are much more likely to produce revolutions than slow incremental reductions in legitimacy for reasons that are quite interesting. But and many rebellions begin with a single incident, you know, the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, these other things, election results. And it's because a lot of people go into the streets at once. So once a lot of people are in the street at once, it's much less risky to join the mob. To be the first aggrieved actor, you have to be really pissed. But to be 2,000 first, you don't have to be. So the trick is to get the thing a shock that produces a lot of people at the beginning that get inflamed and amplified. And then the cops have to defect to the revolution, as they did in the case of Iran, and many other cases, Bolshevik revolution, these other things. So it's just it's meant to be unexplanatory. I wouldn't be able to predict anything in particular, although it ain't good. That's my prediction.
So a word about revolutions. There was a major revolution right across Eastern Europe and on into the Soviet Union. 1989 through about 1991. And at least from the point of view of the West, we don't regard that as something of a collapse. It was maybe a reset to how those regions were run. I could give you my argument just in one sentence. I come from Ireland. We have had a revolution there since the Middle Ages, just about once every generation or once every 50 years. The United States had its own revolution as well. These were regarded as something for the good. What I think is going on is a profound malaise or an unease about prospects for employment and prospects for doing well. And that unease seems to be everywhere from wherever, Algeria, Middle East, on through to highly developed countries. And that in turn is bringing a dissatisfaction with the status quo, which is bringing these bubblings up of so-called revolution. What I've noticed here is that there's a major forgetfulness in this country that revolution is typically regarded as something reprehensible and to be avoided, yet the country was founded on that.
If I may, the other one, another thing that's very interesting about social media. Sorry. The other thing that's interesting about social media and all this is that if you look at the Arab Spring or the Hong Kong rebellions or these other things, they're leaderless in the sense that there's no identifiable Mao Zedong or V.I. Lenin or other people. And I think the capacity for self-organized revolutions is a very important development enabled by social media. And so I also have a little toy model about the Arab Spring that tries to, incorporate that. But I think that social media is ushering in an age of leaderless revolutions.
I'll take one more question before we close out for the day. Tim?
Thank you. Kind of on the same topic, but so collective action problems are really hard, but what should be the action is also really hard. And when a lot of people in this room who are very thoughtful on and very learned on certain topics, it starts to sound like I know a lot about ecology, therefore I should be the one that makes decisions about climate change. Whereas I would think that it's really hard to know what you would do about climate change, and it's a very complex adaptive system, and it's very challenging to know what to do with the euro or know what to do with AI and job loss and distribution of wealth, and those are topics that are really hard and not knowable and unforecastable and leads to unintended consequences. And so I was struck when you said before, it's not what the majority of people want, but the way that people talk is not about adjudicating difference of choices within a set of decisions within a collective action problem. It's binary, I don't support changing distribution of wealth, or I support changing distribution of wealth. But even within each of those domains, it's there's very little visibility on how you would create a democratic group of individuals to voice an opinion on one choice or the other. So I was thinking about what is your opinion on what's a better way of getting inputs from people or institutions or getting more information such that the choices can be adjudicated instead of the kind of trivial, should we do something about a big problem?
Take a whack at that?
Yeah. I'm comforted often by going back into history, and what interests me is the economic setup in England around 1850. The Industrial Revolution had hit by then. There were railroads, there were textile mills, there was an incredible amount of additional production, and yet people were working in quite awful conditions in Manchester in the mills, working 14-hour shifts, 6 days, 7 days a week sometimes, and being very ill-used. What strikes me about that is that it took 30 to 100 years for conditions to improve. Typically, it's not governments that step in and say we have to do something. It's more that there are concerned people. They could be nurses, or they might have been sometimes peers of the realm, Lord this and Lord that, sometimes lawyers, but concerned people. And they get in and they say we need to do something about sending little boys up chimneys as chimney sweeps, etc. We really need to rethink what's going on. And bit by bit, the economy or society adapts. There are better labor laws. Trade unions or labor unions came about, at least got much more power. So society does adapt. My question at the moment is, can we adapt rapidly enough? We will adapt, I think, to climate change. The question is, will we adapt fast enough? A lot of that has to do with public opinion, but a lot of it has to do with small changes and just getting things done in the right direction.
I would just, one big thing that Hayek got right was in complex social systems, predicting the future is a dangerous business. And Popper's answer to that challenge was what he called piecemeal social engineering. So he was very much against utopianism and kind of big grand plans. But he saw that, in the historical record supports this to Brian's examples, that you sort of make reforms kind of one step at a time, and you sort of march your way forward. And you try stuff, and not everything works, but some stuff does work, and you do more of what works and less of what doesn't. That's an evolutionary process. And evolution, can grope its way toward whatever goals exist in the system in a complex system. And one could argue the three great inventions of the Enlightenment, taking into account the blind spots, were three evolutionary systems: science, which is a evolutionary epistemological system; democracy, which is a kind of evolutionary political system; and markets, which are an evolutionary economic system. But we've, as I argued yesterday, in recent decades had an ideology that has said the only fitness function that matters is the kind of maximization of of self-interest and a narrow definition of profits and so on. So we've had a system that has been adapting to that and given us the results that we have today. So one of the key ways to handle these big challenges is to reinvigorate these evolutionary processes in our society and get them pointed at solving our big societal challenges.
So unfortunately, we are going to have to stop now, but let's thank all of our panelists again. We're going to take a quick 15-minute break before our last panel on applied issues. If you have not yet done so and are interested in signing up for